It had me muted there. Okay. Usually unmutes automatically. Well, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Podcast. And today I'm joined by David Mirsch. And today we're discussing his contribution to the Journal of Higher Criticism. It's titled Early Dating of the Gospels, A Fresh Perspective. The link to purchase this issue of the Journal of Higher Criticism will be in the description below and in the pinned comment as well. And with that being said, Dave, thank you for joining me today.
Glad to be here. Good to see you.
Yeah, likewise. One more thing before we continue. So I have this GoFundMe up. The link to donate to it will be in the description below and the pinned comment as well. So if anybody can show their support and donate, I greatly appreciate it. Okay. So for the first question, when you say early dating of the Gospels, fresh perspective, and I know you've discussed this before on the show in the past, in your book, The Open Tomb, and so what I'd like to ask you now is, what's different? Did you find what you believe to be additional evidence for your perspective of the early dating of the Gospels?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I came across that kind of changed my attitude. Not changed it, but reinforced it. One of those was understanding the Greek terminology for the abomination, indicating that it's a singular neuter noun, which would kind of disregard some of the other suppositions as far as the later dating of the Gospels. If it's a singular thing, not a male or a female thing, the chances were better that it was the statue Caligula was threatening to put in front of the temple, the Jerusalem temple, which would have desecrated the temple. The other thing that I came across too was, and this doesn't have so much to do with the early dating, but the fact that Philo writes about many things that people argue about that couldn't have happened, but Philo's writing makes it clear that they could happen. The idea of a corpse being taken down from the crucifixion, the cross, could happen. Philo knew of a man who had been crucified, who had been taken down because they wanted the dead to enjoy the festivals and the holidays, just as the living did. So that was kind of unique. The other thing too is that I came across and better understood that Joseph of Arimathea, it's not a town, it's a designation for a person. It is based on the Greek word airo, A-I-R-O, transliterated, which means to take down, to remove, to take away. And Mathea, or Matthew, the gift of God. So basically, Joseph of Arimathea is Joseph who took down the gift of God, which was Jesus. That, to me, indicates that his father, Joseph, was the one who actually took him down from the cross and buried him in a new tomb. There are other minor things, but in conjunction with that, I realized that the order of the Gospels that are accepted today isn't correct. The correct order is Mark, Luke, Matthew. And that becomes important because one of the synoptic progressions that I came across indicates that one of the not parables, but one of the stories that are in the Gospels talks about Jairus's daughter. And Mark and Luke both use that name, Yaris. Matthew does not use that name. And the reason for that is that Mark and Luke were writing before 39. Matthew was writing after 39. And the reason you get to that is that Yaris is kind of a metaphor for Herod Antipas. And that Yaris comes from the Havoth Yar, which was a geographical location east of the Jordan that matched up with Antipas's tetrarchy. And they're using Yaris as basically a name for Herod Antipas. Well, if the Gospels were written later, it's hard to imagine that the writers would have included Yaris in Mark and Luke, but not had him in Matthew's version. That seems to indicate that Matthew wrote after Antipas was removed from power in 39. So these are kind of things that, I look at and I go, it makes more sense that these were written early. And there's much more to it than that, but those are the kind of things that I kind of came across that gave me a fresher perspective on the early dating.
Can you also tell us a bit about Paul's use of the Gospels and also including the pastoral epistles use of the Gospels, like Luke, for instance?
Well, first and foremost, there's only one reason to use Paul in regards to the historical Jesus, and that is that Paul is writing in opposition to Jesus's movement. Other than that, why any scholar would take Paul's testimony about these things seriously, I don't understand. Paul is a self-admitted liar. He is self-admitted to persecuting the early Jesus followers. He has this mystical, magical vision of Jesus, but he's never met Jesus. He doesn't teach what Jesus is teaching. He goes in a different direction. If you put him in a modern court today as a witness, he'd be thrown out immediately because, he's not reliable. I mean, anybody that says, I'm going to lie to get what I want, you can't trust that. You can't trust that evidence. You can't trust what he's saying. So I pretty much disregard him. And because he was writing in opposition to Jesus, I'm convinced that he was writing in opposition to the Gospels, that he knew the Gospels, that it was a written source back then, which would have been a bit unusual. And because he's writing against them, he's obviously aware that they exist. Now, he obviously knew that the movement existed because he persecuted the followers. But I think he also knew that the Gospels were there. So I'm a firm believer that the Gospels were written early before Paul was doing his writing. And you get into, and you and I have talked about this before, direction of transmission. And I don't particularly see a problem with reversing that and saying Paul was aware of Luke and he leaned on that and used some of that. I also think that's the case with Josephus, that Josephus was aware of some of these writings, the Gospels, because historians traditionally look to earlier writings to write their histories. So as far as any similarities or any, direction of transmission, Josephus as a historian would tend to look to the past, look to the Gospels, to inform the histories that he was trying to write. So that's basically it. I mean, other than looking at Paul as in opposition to the works of Jesus, you can't trust anything the guy is saying. Why would you use him to determine the historicity of Jesus? I mean, this comes into play, especially with Richard Carrier's work. If you take Paul out of his works, what are you left with? You're left with myth. You're left with mimesis of Greek and Roman earlier, stories about heroes, all of which could have been used for a living person in the Gospels. They could have been taken and used because the audience for the Gospels would have been fully aware of those things, of those earlier heroes. Other than that, it pretty much ruins his argument. And I think that's true of most of the mythicists. If they're relying on Paul and his celestial Jesus, and you look at Paul and you go, yeah, you can't believe this guy, big part of their argument falls apart.
Can you tell us a bit about Jairus, Jairus and his daughter, and how that figures into your dating of Mark and Luke?
Well, again, because Mark and Luke use that name. And again, there's coded messages in the Gospels. And I know that sounds like a conspiracy theorist type of approach, but the truth of the matter is that when the Gospels were being written, and they're being written under Roman occupation, and they're written as politically subversive material, you can't say a lot openly. You have to couch things in different terms. So what I've noticed is that the mention of men, whether it be leaders or priests or whatever, generally refer to the male population, the leaders of a male of a population. The women in stories tend to relate to the populations themselves. So when the Gospels are talking about Jairus's daughter, they're talking about that population east of the Jordan River, and they're talking about a younger population. Now, right before the Jairus' story, daughter's story comes up, there's a story of the old woman who has been menstruating for 12 years. She's ritually unclean. She touches, Jesus's garment and she's healed. That's the older part of that population, that same population. Okay, and what the Gospels say, Jesus walks in and he says something in Aramaic. And believe me, I don't speak Aramaic, so I'm going to probably botch this. But the comment is Talitha Kumai, and that basically translates to, little girl, I say to you, rise up. And what Jesus is proponing, basically saying at that point, is the younger people in this society need to rise up. They need to rise up against Rome. And in a broader sense, they need to rise up against the temple priests and the system that really impoverishes the population. So I just see that clearly as political propaganda. And, you can have a different view of it, but it seems pretty striking to me that given Mark and Luke using the name and Matthew not using the name would indicate to me, under those circumstances, that Mark and Luke were written before 39 and Matthew was written sometime after 39.
What strongly indicates to you that Matthew was written after 39, aside from the naming and not naming of Jairus?
There's what I call synoptic progressions that lead to the distinct order of Mark, Luke, Matthew. And one of those is the baptism stories that are in there. In Mark, when Jesus comes up out of the water, he sees a spirit in the sky above him. In Luke, when Jesus comes up out of the water, he sees a Holy Spirit. So it's a step up. We've gone from Spirit to Holy Spirit. In Matthew, when Jesus rises from the water, he sees the Spirit of God. So you can't, it would be very, very hard to understand that if Matthew came before Luke and Luke was aware of Matthew, that Matthew would omit God from the baptism story. I don't think that would happen. Okay, so that places Luke before Matthew. Since I've already kind of determined when, these, and there's more to it than that, obviously, we'll get into Philo and other things, but that to me indicates that Matthew is written later and that Mark and Luke never had any idea that the Spirit of God was mentioned in Matthew. Trying to think what else. It's really interesting, but the Gospels fix themselves. Whoever, and I think, I'll say it right now, I believe Philo wrote Mark and Luke, and I'm pretty sure Matthew. But each one fixes problems that the previous one left. For example, the abbreviated ending in Mark was fixed in Luke. Okay? Both Mark and Luke have the tomb open when the women come. Matthew corrects that and says that it's closed. There's a reason why. In Mark and Luke, the open tomb is a human situation. In other words, there's nothing very miraculous about an open tomb and a missing body. Okay. Matthew sees that and corrects it and closes the door on the tomb so that when the tomb is open and the body is missing, it becomes much more miraculous. Okay, he didn't just walk out of the tomb. How did he, where's the body? If the tomb was closed, where's the body? So you see that in these progressions, you see them kind of correcting things from the earlier ones that maybe didn't make a lot of sense or were misleading. And so the following one shows the corrections. That would indicate to me that the synoptics were written very close together, that this was an ongoing attempt at political propaganda. And again, I'll say Philo, as the writer, wrote Mark in a hurry because things were happening right then and there. And he abbreviated the ending because he was in a hurry. And scholars will tell you that that is the sense in Mark, that things are happening very quickly. There's an urgency to it all. So Philo sees this and, gets it out there, but then he realizes, well, I wrote it so quickly, I didn't finish the ending. Well, it's already out there. People already know about it. So he writes Luke to correct that problem. And again, you see that, okay, people may be talking about, well, the tomb is open. So what? The body's gone. So what? Matthew is written to correct that problem. Mark and Luke don't have any soldiers, any guards at the tomb. Matthew does. That corrects the problem. That means that Mark and Luke, somebody could have come along and stolen the body. Matthew corrects that. He has guards there. He has the tomb sealed. No, nobody could have gotten in there. Nobody could have stolen the body. So he fixes that problem. So the Gospels are written pretty close together. I don't know if it was months, certainly within a year or two, maybe sooner. But it was important to get the story out and to make it believable.
What is the evidence? What is the evidence that Philo of Alexandria wrote Mark, Luke, and Matthew?
Well, there's numerous things. There was a study done by Stanford University's School of Philosophy a while ago that did a very in-depth study of Philo. One of the things they determined, and this is probably the most important factor, is that he wrote Jewish works, he wrote them in Greek, and he had Latin titles to them. It was unique among ancient authors to write that way. He was the only one that was writing that way. Well, that's what the Gospels are. They're Jewish works written in Greek with Latin titles. Mark, Luke, and Matthew are not people, they're titles. Mark is from the Latin Marcus, for the god Mars, the god of war. Luke is for the Latin Lucifer, the bringer of light, not the Satan demon type thing that we see today in Lucifer, but back then that was the bringer of light. That was a name that was associated with Jesus. Matthew is basically the gift of God. So that's a very strong, almost like a fingerprint from a crime scene, that Philo wrote these works. But there are other things as well. Philo was very much into the study of allegory, not only in the Old Testament, in his own works, and as I've kind of pointed out already, there's a lot of allegorical interpretation in the Gospels. Okay, so that would be another very close similarity to the works that Philo was putting out and his scope of interest. Allegory was very, very important to him in determining the true meaning of things. Philo used and studied in the Old Testament chiastic structure. He used it in his own works. He saw it in the Old Testament, and it's present in the Gospels. There again, you look at that and you go, okay, is that a fluke or is that from a specific author? Well, you start combining these things and you say, yeah, okay, it could be one guy that's, got a fingerprint in how he writes and what he writes about. He's into allegory. Okay. He does the chiastic structure. He was well-versed, Philo was well-versed in Greek myths, ancient legends. I mean, this guy was brilliant, and his scope of study and knowledge and stuff was almost unheard of back then. I don't know if you'd call him a genius, but he certainly knew a lot of stuff. And a lot of that stuff that he knew and was familiar with is used in the Gospels, sometimes almost verbatim. When talking about certain Greek heroes, there are passages in the Gospels that are very, very similar to Homeric epics and what have you. So that adds to it as well. Philo had a real motive for writing the Gospels, this political propaganda, which was intended to stir up a revolt of the people against Rome and the temple, in a sense. His treatment by Caligula in the embassy to Rome, when he went to Rome to speak for the Jews in Alexandria that were being attacked by the Greeks that lived there, Caligula ignored him, wouldn't let him speak at all. Caligula listened to the other side, the Greek side. He didn't want to listen to Philo at all. Now, that's pretty insulting if you're somebody like Philo, who is really intelligent and has a real standing in his community, enough so that he was, sent on this, this embassy. One of the things that Philo commented on, and it's just kind of a slight paraphrase, but he said, "In the presence of a tyrant, the wise man remains silent." In other words, he wasn't going to push it. He would just accept the insult and walk away. But he also said, if the opportunity arises, the wise man should attack the tyrant. So that's what the Gospels were intended for. It's his way, anonymously, of trying to foment a revolution against Roman occupation, and specifically Caligula. I have to tell you, I don't see any motivation in a later dating. In fact, maybe you know this. I haven't been able to find anything about it, but maybe you know. I can't find a source for who was the first person, scholar, theologian, whatever, to suggest that the Gospels were based on, Mark 13 specifically is based on the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. If you know, or anybody out there that's going to throw a super chat in and they know, please let me know. Other than that, I don't see any motivation for doing that, for including Mark 13. People say, well, it's a way for, us to prove that he had the power of prophecy. Somebody after 70 wrote this and plugged it back into the Gospels to prove that he had the power of prophecy. No, it doesn't work. If the abomination is a single thing, neuter, not male or female, the most likely thing is the statue that Caligula threatened to send and put in front of the temple, which would desecrate it. During Jesus's trial, somebody came along and said, yeah, this guy Jesus was threatening to tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. The temple when it was desecrated, wasn't going to be destroyed by the Romans. It was going to be destroyed by Jesus and other like-minded fundamentalists who were going to say, this statue defiles the temple. We can't use it anymore. We're going to tear it down. The fact that Jesus said he was going to rebuild it in 3 days says to me that because he was a radical fundamentalist, I think, that he was going to rebuild the temple like the original tabernacle, that he was going to build it in 3 days. It was going to be a tent type thing. This is why there were curtains over the Holy of Holies within the temple. That was a nod to the original tabernacle, that the Holy of Holies, where God was going to dwell, was retaining that piece of the original tabernacle. There were going to be curtains. Well, Jesus's attitude was, let's get back to the beginning. Let's rebuild this thing in 3 days. Let's build it like a real tent, like the one that, Moses had. And, we will start over. So that's why I think the dating has to be earlier. And Luke dedicates his gospel to Theophilus. Now, scholars have kind of ingenuously suggested that, well, that just means a lover of God. It's not a name necessarily. It's a, application to, who knows who. Could be anybody. Well, if you move the dating to where I think it should be for Luke, somewhere between 37 and 41 CE, Luke is dedicating his to the high priest of the temple, who was Theophilus ben Ananias. And he was the high priest between 37 and 41. You don't need to kind of jimmy jack that around and say, oh, well, could have been this and could have been. Yeah, absolutely could have been. But the most likely scenario is because of the threat by Caligula and the threat of the statue. Luke was writing to the high priest, Theophilus. That's why it's dedicated to him. Some of this stuff seems pretty obvious to me, and I have to say that the idea of consensus thinking is really dangerous in regards to history, and especially with trying to sort out the historical Jesus. The consensus thinking on many things is just flat out wrong. If you want to look at an example of that, consensus thinking says that Jesus was crucified and died either in 30 or 31 or 33 CE. This is based on a comment in the Gospels that he was about 30. Jesus was about 30 when he started his ministry. Okay, well, let's work back from that. If that's the case, then he would have had to have been born sometime between 1 BCE and 1 CE, or even later, 3 CE, to get to those dates where consensus thinking says he was, crucified and died. Well, you look at the other end of that, and the consensus thinking is, well, he was probably born before Herod the Great died in 4 BCE. That doesn't match up with him being crucified 30 to 33. It doesn't work. The other thing too, the consensus thinking, when you listen to these guys in their videos, they say Jesus died, da, 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 da. How do they get that information? There's really kind of 2 sources. There's the historical source that crucifixion was almost always deadly, that crucified victims died on the cross. The other thing is they get it from the Gospels, that the Gospel stories of the crucifixion indicate that Jesus supposedly died on the cross. You can refute both of those positions very easily. For one thing, in any human endeavor, like crucifixion, capital punishment, whatever, when the Romans are crucifying hundreds and thousands of people, mistakes get made. I mean, that's just human nature. You can't get away from it. Statistics indicate that at the very least, 1% failure rate in anything that humans do is a possibility. Well, if you're crucifying thousands of people, that 1% is a pretty big number. The fact that, and again, I have not found a source for this, but scholars often point to the fact, especially Christian apologists, point to the fact that, well, the Romans were really good and made sure that their crucified victims died. Well, that's not realistic to assume that a Roman soldier, no matter how many times he's crucified somebody, is 100% right. But these apologists and other scholars will say that's why the Romans had a death penalty for any soldiers that made the mistake of allowing a crucified victim to survive. Well, you don't have a rule like that if it never happens. If nobody ever survived a crucifixion, you don't need a rule in the army that says, if you botch this, we're going to hang you on the same cross. They had that rule because mistakes got made. Okay. And the Gospels, their whole point is to show that Jesus survived his crucifixion. So, of course, they're going to say he died while on the cross. But then he said he's seen 3 days later. Well, then he didn't die on the cross. I mean, Christian apologists will say, well, it's a miracle. Well, as a historian, I'm looking at different things and going, I can't automatically fall on a miracle explanation. Is there any way it was humanly possible to achieve that? And of course there is. Anyway, I'm off topic here. I'm really sorry, Jacob. I kind of got on a roll there.
No. The idea Jesus surviving the crucifixion is part of the title. You're not off topic. But to answer your question about the earliest known individual held view of market priority, I believe is Gottlob Christian Storr. He lived in the late 18th century and he died within the first 5 years of the 19th century. I think he died in 1805. And the one that centered it around Mark 13, I believe, is Heinrich Julius Holtzmann. He was born in 1842 and died in 1910. So that should give you your answer to both questions.
But do we know what source material they used to arrive at those conclusions? That's more what I'm interested in. The reason I want to know the earliest person to suggest 70, CE as the date after which the Gospels are written is because I want to know what their sources were. Or did they just pull this out of thin air and go, oh, yeah, they must have been talking about the destruction of the temple, in 70 CE. That's why this is in Mark 13. Well, okay.
I believe that's actually Holtzmann's argument. It's also comparing Mark to Josephus, I think, because the consensus gets their ideas from him.
Right. So, no, if I'm hearing you correctly, there's no real source material for those conclusions other than the fact that these guys kind of drew those conclusions based on Josephus and what have you, and then they kind of plugged it in, and ever since then, most of the scholars go along with that. I don't find that very compelling. I think it's much more compelling that Philo had a real good reason to write these things. And just to be clear, I think Jesus and his father were preparing this anyway. I think they were preparing the whole idea of creating a dying and rising God. And Philo is the one that put pen to paper or papyrus and wrote these Gospels down. And if this is going to sound real far out, but it could be very true. You have to understand that if Jesus survived the crucifixion and he was a contemporary to Philo, did he swap stories with Philo? Did he tell him about his conversations with Pilate, or the Herodians? In the consensus thinking, people say, well, how could the writer of the gospel have known what was said in the garden, or what was said to Pilate, or what was said here, when they were basically, Jesus was by himself or just with this other one person and Jesus died. Well, how would anybody know what was said that was put into the Gospels? Well, if Jesus survived the crucifixion and he's in town, he's there to talk to whoever the writers were. So that kind of kills that argument. But again, I firmly believe that the motivation to write, and this is what scholars don't really touch on. What's the motivation for writing the Gospels? You hear various kind of toss-offs, like, well, it was decades later after his death, and people were thinking that, we need to write this stuff down, to preserve the memories and what have you. And it's like, why? If he died on the cross, and, why are you concerned about preserving the memory of a failed Messiah? It doesn't make sense. However, if you're Philo and you have been really, really pissed off with Caligula, you have real motivation to go to work on this. You have very strong, and it's not just about getting back at the Romans or getting back at Caligula. It is the preservation of Jewish culture and society and the people, the individual people that were being threatened by these things. Philo saw all that, saw his culture being attacked, being threatened, and he wanted to do something about it. And what was necessary was a revolution. Anyway, I think, again, motivation is really a key factor in determining these things and dating them. And the motivation to make somebody like Jesus, who has already supposedly performed miracles and shown how, powerful he is, and he can defeat death and this, that, and the other thing. But let's, in addition to that, show that he's, capable of prophecy. No. It's really hard to buy that as motivation for writing these. It's just difficult as hell. I don't buy it at all. And again, you got Paul writing in opposition to the movement, because Paul is connected to Rome, and he knows that these are political propaganda, and he certainly doesn't want a revolution. So he's going to steer the movement in a whole different direction. And he doesn't need to have met Jesus to do this. He creates a Jesus. He creates a celestial Jesus who is all about peace, love, and this, that, and the other thing, blah, 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 and steers it away. And that's the Christianity that he did a good job. That's the Christianity we have today, based on Paul. We don't have the revolutionary Jesus historically. So Paul did a great job, and people continue to buy his stuff. Especially, again, the mythicists use that to formulate the stronger part of their argument that Jesus didn't exist. Or if he did, he was a totally different guy than, Christianity has labeled him. So I don't know. It's, to me, again, you can't get caught up in consensus thinking. You can't get caught up in let me rephrase that. When you see consensus thinking, take the time to analyze it and see if it's valid. Like I said, the consensus thinking about 30 to 33 for the crucifixion doesn't work with a birth before Herod. It doesn't. In fact, a birth before Herod works very well for Jesus, the historical Jesus, because if he was born, say, in 6 BCE, 2 years before Herod passed away, and he was about 30 when he started his ministry, that puts him in the time frame of Herod Antipas building Tiberias and forcing the Jewish population, some of the Jewish population, to actually populate Tiberias. And that was a no-go as far as Jesus was concerned, because Tiberias was built on an ancient cemetery. So a Jew living in that city would have been ritually unclean every single day that they lived there. This was an assault on Jewish custom, belief, faith, you name it. That was one of the worst things that you could do for the Jews. And I think when Jesus came on board in like 24 CE, which would have been 30 years after being born in 6 BCE, that was one of the first things that he did. He spoke out against that. And you see that in the Gadarene demoniac story, which is about, again, a man being chained in a cemetery. The man is all the Jewish leaders. He's representing all the Jewish leaders. They're being forced to live on a cemetery. Jesus chases out the demon, and the demon, whose name is Legion, turns into 2,000 pigs that rush off a cliff and drown in the Sea of Galilee. Okay, so you got Legion, you got pigs, you got 2,000 of them. When Antipas built Tiberias and he wanted to populate it with Jews too, there were a lot of pagans that lived there. There were a lot of Gentiles that lived there, but he wanted some Jews in there too, to kind of oversee the governing of the city. He required the help of a Roman legion to keep those Jews there. And the Roman legion that was used, that was in the area at that time, they'd been in Syria and other locales, Caesarea and what have you, was the 10th Fretensis Legion. And interestingly enough, their mascot, which was on all their battle flags, was a wild boar. So you got the boar, you got 2,000 pigs. It's representative. Those 2,000 pigs represent a legion, a part of a legion that were designed and needed by Antipas to keep the Jews in Tiberias. That's allegory. That's what that story means. That's when Jesus started his ministry. Tiberias was started in either 18 or 19 BCE, and it went on for a number of years, the building of it. It didn't happen overnight. I mean, it took some years to get that done. So when Jesus is telling this story, he's telling it about what's going on in the actual Tiberias and what he does not like and what he's planning on doing. He's going to take on the Roman legion that is forcing people to live there. I don't know. You cannot take the Gospels at face value. I mean, you can in a sense that they're written in different layers. There's face value, what they say is what happened. There's another layer, and then there's the real layer, which is the message that they're trying to portray. And only a few people, and Jesus says this throughout the Gospels, most of you aren't going to understand this stuff, but there are a few of you that are. Now, he's not necessarily writing for illiterate people who are not going to be able to read the Gospels. It's being written for literate people, people in power, people in local power. These are stories that are being sent to people that will understand the allegorical nature of the stories. Now, there's another theory that comes out of all this, and that is the Shekinah, or the not God, but his presence. And I think that is connected to an astronomical situation. And it actually involves when things happened and when Jesus said he was going to come back and he was going to return. There were 3 major rebellions in the first century. There were minor ones alongside these, but there was the one in 6 CE with Judas the Galilean. There was the Samaritan uprising in 36, and then there was the first Jewish revolt in 66. What they have in common is that they are 30 years apart, which indicated to me that there was some cause and effect there. Something was happening every 30 years or thereabouts that was kind of conditioning or instigating these revolts. And it just so happens that every 29.5 years, Saturn returns to the same place on the eastern horizon as a morning star. And I haven't been able to get in touch with a archaeoastronomer yet to determine exactly where that would be, type of thing. My guess is that it came up over the shoulder of the Mount of Olives. Now you have to understand that the temple grounds were built with the tabernacle in mind. And the Mount of Olives represented Mount Sinai. So when the morning star, when Saturn comes up, that is the Shekinah, the presence of God. And they would, I believe, open the doors to the temple so that the presence could go into the Holy of Holies. It seems to me that when Jesus said, I will return while some of you are still alive, if he's, surviving the crucifixion in 37, which is when I think he was crucified, another 30 years on top of that would be 66, would be just about 66. And I think the story in Josephus of Jesus ben Ananias is the story of the gospel Jesus actually returning. He actually comes back in 62, but he doesn't let his identity be known until the war begins in 66. Then he is called by Josephus Jesus ben Ananias. So I think that component of nearly every 30 years, the Shekinah was at the temple inside the Holy of Holies, was the belief that God is here, God is among us, and now's the time to revolt because God will take our side. God will support us, he will help us, we will win. It didn't work out that way, but people have latched on to the fact that, oh, Jesus said he was coming back, but he said he was coming back when some of these people would still be alive. Hey, he hasn't come back. No, he came back, but he was killed. He was killed on the ramparts of the city of Jerusalem by the Romans. That's what Josephus indicates happened to him. So again, I see the earlier dating in and around 37 to 41, maybe even a little later than 41, is better attested through the data, what limited data we do have, than the idea that it was that the Gospels were written after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. There's much more that explains them earlier than there ever does as later stuff. Now, and here's a very important part. People often ask, well, if Jesus was all that, why don't we have any written records of him, and what he did? Well, we do. We have the Gospels, but people don't want to accept those because they think they're no good. That, they have discrepancies between each of them. They're myth, they're fiction, they're this, they're that. No, you can't use those as a source. No, I take them as a source. If you understand allegory and if you understand political propaganda, you can take the Gospels as being historical documents. So for me, the earlier dating just completes that whole picture. And here's another thing too, little thing, and it's in the Gospel of John. The Pharisees say to Jesus, "You're not yet 50. How can you talk like this? You're not yet 50." Well, there's two things about dating Jesus's life. The fact that they mentioned that he starts his ministry when he's about 30, which is the same age, according to the Old Testament, that was the earliest a man could become a priest. It's in Numbers, I think either 3 or 4, I think it's 4, that it's mentioned numerous times that a man had to be 30 to become a priest. So I think that is telling as far as Jesus starting his ministry at 30, he was a priest. The other thing is that if he was not yet 50, according to John, that means he was in his 40s. So if you take a birth date of 6 BCE and you add, you look at an age in the 40s, you wind up kind of going to 36, 37, when he is 43. That's when these things were happening. We got to get over this idea that the few comments that seem to indicate the time frame are everything that's required. No, just because those are comments that are made in the Gospels does not mean that they are the whole of his story. So, you say that this happened and that happened and da 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 da. Yeah, but he could have started, like I'm saying, he could have started in his ministry in 24 when he was about 30. Not 30 CE, not 31, not 33, 24. Could he have been in his 40s? Yeah. Because those early 30 dates don't work out. They don't work out mathematically with a date of birth before Herod the Great dies. They just don't. So could he have been in his 40s? Could he have been 43 when these things were happening? Absolutely. We don't know that because it's not written down. What is written down is misleading, and it has been taken as the gospel that that's actually what happened, that he was 30 when this happened. Consensus didn't seem to do the math on these things. I don't know. Pretty easy. It's a simple math question, but if it doesn't work, you got to look elsewhere. You got to, redefine things. So if the Pharisees are saying you're not yet 50, he's in his 40s. If you take 37 as when he was crucified, and you add 6 from 6 BCE, you get 43. That's when it was happening. I don't know. Anyway, what else you want to know?
Well, we do have a super chat question that's been lingering around for a while.
All right.
So Laura Knight, thank you for your super chat. Explain Acts 1:3. After his suffering, he presented himself to them and gave many convincing proofs that he was alive.
First of all, and I'll be very honest, I really focused on the Synoptics, okay, and John a little bit, but primarily the Synoptics. I believe the Acts were written afterwards, obviously, and they had a different agenda than the original Gospels. Okay, so I didn't go to them a lot to try and figure out the historical story behind the Gospels. That's, to me, that's pretty basic. He survived the cross, and so he went and showed him that he was alive. It's not a stretch to think, and I keep saying that he survived the cross. That wasn't too difficult to do if you had a plan to do it. If you knew that you were going to be crucified and you planned to survive it, you could do it. So, although it's a terrifying experience for any individual to go through, if you're nationalistic, if you're trying to recreate the covenant with God so that you can restore Israel to its proper place without Roman occupation, you might be prepared to make that sacrifice physically. And to me, clearly, Jesus was prepared to make that sacrifice. He was willing to endure that kind of pain in order to implement the fact that he appeared dead and then he appeared alive. Well, that'll get your attention, Now, I'm sure that, and this is borne out by how the Jews responded to him. There were obviously large groups of people that didn't believe that he had died on the cross, that he was not the Messiah. There would have been people who would have bought the story, would have been amazed by it. And it would have been like a game of telephone, Hey, I had a friend who was there and he saw him on the cross and he was dead. And then another friend of mine actually saw him and heard him speak a couple of days later and he was alive. Well, then it becomes, well, it's a miracle. Or he's a godlike person. He can defeat death. We see it today. I mean, look at how many different sects there are in Christianity because people are still interpreting the same information in different ways. And that would have been true back then. So, it's not far-fetched to think that he planned it. I think his father planned it as well. And that he was willing to take those risks to foment a revolt. That was a sign. Surviving death was a sign that God was with him. And that's what was, I think, meant to be portrayed, is that here's this guy, dies on the cross. He's alive a couple of days later. That can only happen as a miracle. That means God has done it, and God is on his side. Therefore, we need to listen to this guy and believe him. So to answer that question, yeah, I don't see that as a problem. That he was going around and showing followers that here I am, I'm alive. He did it because he knew he was going to do it. Now, there are other mitigating factors in when and where it was done. It would have been done after 32 CE, and I'll tell you why. Tiberius set out a decree to the entire empire to respect local customs. And that was done because he got rid of his second in command, Sejanus. And Sejanus was an anti-Semite. He was stirring things up and creating problems. And I'm pretty much convinced he's the one that hired Pilate, who was pretty much anti-Semitic as well, to oversee that area. And as a result of that decree, trying to think, was it late 31 or 32, somewhere around there? The idea that, as in Mel Gibson's horrific movie, that Jesus was half dead, he was beaten so severely that nobody could survive it, is nonsense. That respecting local traditions and customs would have meant that Jesus would have received the Jewish Old Testament flogging, which would have been 39 strokes. I've read up on that, and there's differing opinions as to what actually the flail would have been like. So I can't really, commit to one or the other. And the idea that they were all on his back is disputed. Some say he was whipped on his front, then on his back. That's part of the 39 lashes. The point is that was survivable. And Jesus would have been aware of that decree. The Jews were certainly aware of it, because they said to Pilate, if you don't kind of listen to us on this stuff, you're not going to be any friend of Caesar's. In other words, I know they bring up king, they say, well, you can't have that attitude towards us because you're fomenting problems with the Jewish population. And you're not going to be a friend of Caesar's if you do that. And I'm pretty sure that Pilate stepped back from his position and said, okay, go ahead. We'll just do 39 lashes. Totally survivable. Again, this is something that was planned for. And again, there's strong motivations for why it was planned for. Put yourself, the nearest I can come to it right now, or close to that, is if you were in occupied France during World War II and the Nazis occupied France, and you were in the underground, you would do things, you would write things, encoded messages. You would try to do what you could to attack them or disrupt them. That is very much what I think Jesus and his movement was about. We're gonna get this thing going. We're gonna go after these guys, and we're gonna get them out of here, because that's what is required to restore the covenant with God. And once that happens, then we will have Israel back. The Romans will be gone. And we have solved that problem.
My final question Could you get into other reasons why you think Philo wrote the Gospels?
There are a couple of things in the Gospels that people question that seem pretty easily to have come from Philo. One of the things is that scholars will question, Jesus's comments on, husbandry, or, mustard seeds, fig trees, these things, grains and fields, various comments about husbandry. And Philo actually wrote an essay on husbandry. And one of the things that he's compared it to was a comment that Moses made, that if you come across a tree that puts out bad fruit, you must cut it down. And that same comment, almost verbatim, is in the Gospels. Jesus is saying, if you come across a tree that puts out bad fruit, you cut it down and put it in the fire. So I would, it's not a big stretch. It's like, could it be just a typical aphorism of that time? Yeah, could be. But it's interesting that it's so closely written to the earlier Moses comment that I think Philo easily could have done that. There was another comment that I lost track of, and it had to do with render unto Caesar that which is Caesar. And Philo wrote in one of his essays something very similar to that. So yeah, I think, the big thing is the fingerprint. If Philo is the only ancient writer that is writing Jewish stuff in Greek with Latin titles, and that's what you see in the Gospels, you got to look at it and go, is it possible? Is it possible that Philo wrote these? And of course it is. And if somebody can refute it, if somebody could come to me and say, there is no way that Philo could have written these things, I'd be happy to hear it. Bring me data that supports your view, and I will change my attitude. But I've looked, and I don't see anything that means that it is not possible for him to have written those things. And again, he had great motivation for doing it. He was insulted by Caligula, and Caligula is threatening to put a statue that in front of the temple, which desecrates the temple. And you have to remember that there's a suggestion that Philo was a priest, that he had made trips to Jerusalem, that he had been involved with temple work. He would not have been happy about that. And he would not have been happy about the fact that Caligula was basically siding with the Greeks, who were killing Jews in the street, burning down synagogues, attacking Jews wherever they saw them. And Caligula, if you read Philo, is indicating that the statue is to have at least one or two legions taking it to the temple. And if any Jew or any synagogue or any holy place for the Jews gets in your way, wipe it out. The only reason these things did not happen is for a Roman military leader who knew what would happen if they did those things, that there would be a complete war in the Middle East with the Jews, and he did not want that. So he delayed the construction of the statue and kept giving excuses to Caligula why it wasn't in place already, until in 41, Caligula dies, is killed off. And it no longer becomes necessary to fulfill that order. The other thing that I should mention too is that if Jesus survived the cross, which seems very likely. The Romans would have declared what we would call now a damnatio memoriae, which is a damning of Jesus's memory. Now, because Jesus was a Jew, he would not have had any coins made up. He would not have any statues made up. He would not have any markers or anything like that, anything in stone. All he would have had would have been probably Pilate's records of the crucifixion. And we don't have any of Pilate's records. He was there for almost 2 decades, and we have 0 copies of any of his records. And whether that's just accidental and they got old and crumbled, or whether people took them and burned them and got rid of them, we don't know. But we don't have any. So the one source that would have perhaps, had the historical Jesus in there is gone. Now, the other thing about that damnatio is that if you speak his name, you're open to the death penalty. And if the Gospels were available, the writers of the Gospels would have been facing the death penalty. So my guess is that they were pretty much secret writings, and they weren't available to everybody. They were kept under wraps pretty well until such time later, maybe in the early 2nd century, that it was no longer a threat to mention Jesus. But that's, there's no way to prove that except that there was a damnatio applied to Sejanus, and any record of him was tried to be wiped out. Any busts, statues, whatever. There was a coin found in Spain that had both his name and Tiberius's name on it, and it's clear that Sejanus's name was stamped out, that somebody took a stamp and got rid of his name. So the Romans were quite capable of trying to erase the history of somebody. And I believe that's what happened. That's why there's no writings. And, what we have is the Gospels. Anyway.
All right, again, everybody, the link to purchase this issue will be in the description below and a pinned comment. Again, it is let me get the exact volume and number. Here we go. Volume 20, issue 2 in the Journal of Higher Criticism. Links in the description below and the pinned comment. Also, the link to the GoFundMe will be down there too in the description and the pinned comment. So if any of you can donate to help me keep this channel going, I appreciate it very much. And Dave, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Jacob.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.